My name is Donnelly Walton. I am the Archival Facility Librarian at the University of Alabama Libraries. This video is free and available to anyone who wants to learn more about DACS. In this video, we will introduce you to DACS Part 2. By the end of this video, you should be familiar with the standards that support archival description, understand the difference between DACS Part 1 and DACS Part 2, and be familiar with the chapters of Part 2. The Society of American Archivists adopted Describing Archives, a Content Standard, or DACS for short, as the official content standard of the U.S. archival community in 2005. DACS replaced the older Archives, Personal Papers, and Manuscripts, APPM. DACS underwent a major revision in 2013 and is now on a continuous revision cycle. DACS is one of several interrelated standards that support the process of archival description. These standards include other content standards, as well as structure and communication standards. Before we dive into Part 2, we'll talk more about these standards and how they relate to and affect DACS. International Standard Archival Description General, ISAD-G, was created and is maintained by the International Council on Archives. International Standard Archival Authority Record for Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, ISAR-CPF, was also created and is maintained by the ICA. Encoded Archival Description, EAD, is the non-proprietary standard for the encoding of finding aids. Encoded Archival Context, Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, EAC-CPF, is the XML schema for ISAR-CPF and was adopted by SAA in 2011 as a standard. It underwent revision in 2022. If you'd like to see EAC-CPF in action, you can look at projects like SNAC, Social Networks, and Archival Content. DACS relies on and is the U.S. implementation of international standards ISAD-G and ISAR-CPF. All of the elements in ISAD-G and ISAR-CPF are incorporated into DACS. Make note of ISAR-CPF as it will come up again later in this video. Note that a new conceptual model, RIG, replaced ISAD-G and ISAR-CPF in 2023. SAA's Council voted in February 2024 to delay integration with RIG until it has become more fully developed. This infographic shows that DACS evolved from previous library and archive standards, and how DACS Part 2 is influenced by and linked to international standards. Since DACS and EAC-CPF are directly related to ISAD-G and ISAR-CPF, they all have common traits. These common traits help us share information more widely, as archivists around the world use similar standards to describe materials. This ease of sharing exemplifies a key principle of archival description. In fact, DACS has 11 principles of archival description, which were all covered in a different video about DACS. Principle 8 says that archival description should be easy to use, reuse, and share. Speaking of the principles of archival description, Principle 4 states that records, agents, activities, and the relationships between them are the 4 fundamental concepts that constitute archival description. In archival work, context is key, and a major source of context for an archival collection is the human element, the histories, the personalities, or activities that generated the materials in question. If you have looked at DACS, you notice that DACS is divided into two distinct sections, Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 focuses on all aspects of the process of describing materials and helps the archivist as they create those descriptions, often then presented in a finding aid. Part 2 is much different and focuses on the creation of archival authority records. So what exactly is an archival authority record? DACS Part 2, Chapter 9 defines it this way. An archival authority record identifies and describes a personal, family, or corporate entity associated with the body of archival materials. Documents relationships between records creators, the records created by them, and/or other resources about them, and may control the creation and use of access points in archival descriptions. Part 2 assists the archivist in creating archival authority records that can be created and maintained separately from the descriptive content if the archivist chooses to do so. Furthermore, Part 2 discusses the advantages of creating and maintaining separate archival records, including the idea that this information can be linked to different descriptions within and outside of the archivist's repository. DACS Part 2 consists of an introduction and 6 chapters, chapters 9 through 14. Chapter 9, Archival Authority Records, explores just what makes an archival authority record, including what constitutes a minimal record. Chapters 10 through 14 provide the rules for creating the records. What is required in an archival authority record? Remember ISAR CPF from earlier? It says that an archival authority record must have 4 types of information: identity, or a name, description, relationships, and control. Not only does DACS Part 2 echo this, but it aligns its chapters directly with Sections 5 and 6 of ISAR CPF. DACS Part 2, Chapter 10 aligns with ISAR CPF, Section 5.1. Chapter 11 aligns with ISAR CPF, Section 5.2, and so forth. Chapter 10, Form of the Name. This chapter guides us to create or find the authorized name of the person, place, or corporate body we want to record. It discusses 2 required elements: the authorized form of the name and the type of entity you're describing. Record the name of the entity being described in the authority record in accordance with standardized vocabularies, or with rules for formulating standardized names. It may be helpful to note here the overlap between Part 1 and Part 2. Rules 2.6 and 2.7 in Part 1 address the identification of creators and their background or history. Part 2 provides more guidance on creating the authority records for those creators and their descriptions. Rule 2.6.1 actually directs us to Part 2 for this guidance. Chapter 11, Description of the Person, Family, or Corporate Body, guides us as we provide description of the entity. Dates of existence are the only requirements, but the chapter covers other possibilities, including geographic information, legal status, functions, occupations, and activities, and the historical summary, just to name a few. The historical summary can be duplicated content from a finding aid. Chapter 12, Related Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families. This chapter helps guide us to describe other entities that are related to the person, family, or corporate bodies that created, assembled, and/or maintained and used archival records. None of these elements are required. Chapter 13, Authority Record Management. This chapter guides us to provide administrative information about the authority record and requires an authority record identifier and a rights statement for the authority record. Chapter 14, Related Archival Materials and Other Resources. This chapter guides us to document external data related to the entity we're describing in the archival authority record. None of this information is required, but it could be very useful. DACS Part 2 concludes with a complete example of an archival authority record. In addition, each chapter includes examples for the area it explores. Thank you for watching this introduction to DACS Part 2. Here's a list of resources for further investigation.